history rarely offers us stories painted in black and white. More often, it unfolds in complex shades of grey where heroes fall short, victims become complicit, and those with power make choices that ripple through generations. The transatlantic slave trade is one such story. We often picture it as a brutal, one-sided assault by European powers upon a helpless continent. Ships arriving from across the seas, capturing unsuspecting villagers, and sailing away with their human cargo into eternal exile. But that version, while emotionally satisfying, is only half the truth, and sometimes, half the truth is more dangerous than a lie. Imagine standing on the sun-scorched coast of West Africa in the 18th century. You are not seeing a raid or an ambush. Instead, you are witnessing a market organized, bustling, regulated. African rulers, draped in fine woven cloth and speaking many dialects, are negotiating terms with European merchants. Nearby, caravans of captured men, women, and children, many of them barefoot, bruised, and broken from weeks of forced marches, await their fate in silence. This is not a scene of chaos. It is a system, and like all systems, it is designed, managed, and maintained, not only by outsiders but from within. What happens when your own people profit from your downfall? That haunting question lingers across 4 centuries of African involvement in the slave trade. While the ships belonged to European empires, the supply chains often began deep inland among African kingdoms who saw opportunity in conquest and commerce. War captives, debtors, and even innocents condemned by religious rituals were transformed into commodities, sold not just by enemies, but sometimes by neighboring rulers, rivals, or even distant kin. To fully understand how over 12 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, we must confront a painful paradox. Africa was not merely a continent plundered, it was also a continent that, in many regions, participated in its own undoing. This is not to absolve the colonial powers or to shift blame away from European greed, brutality, and racism. Rather, it is to shine light into the full architecture of a tragedy. For when we reduce history to simple villains and victims, we fail to grasp the true cost of betrayal, of complicity, of silence bought with profit. African kings and merchants who exchanged lives for muskets or cloth could never have imagined the centuries of sorrow that would follow. And those sold into bondage, those who watched their homeland disappear over the horizon, carried with them not only trauma, but a question that still echoes. Who allowed this to happen? In this story, there are no easy answers, but by exploring the hidden mechanisms, the networks, markets, and political choices that made the transatlantic slave trade possible, we can begin to uncover a deeper truth. This is a story of power and pain, of ambition and loss. It is a story that begins not in the holds of slave ships, but in the heart of Africa itself, before the first Portuguese sails ever touched the West African coast. Slavery was already woven into the social and political fabric of many African societies, but it looked different in scale, in purpose, and in moral interpretation. It was not yet a machine of mass human export, not yet an economy fueled by foreign hunger for free labor. Slavery in pre-colonial Africa was often localized, deeply embedded in traditions, rituals, and hierarchical structures, and while still a denial of freedom, it existed in a world where bondage could be temporary, redemptive, or even honorable under certain cultural lenses. The concept of slavery, of owning another human being, was not foreign to Africa. But the transformation of that system into a transcontinental nightmare required something more. Outside demand and internal adaptation. In many African communities, slavery emerged as a consequence of war. Captives were absorbed into the victors' households, sometimes as domestic labor, sometimes as concubines, and occasionally as adopted kin. These individuals could rise in status, earn their freedom, or become trusted advisors. In some societies, They were treated more like dependents than chattel. But this does not make the system benign. It was still exploitative, still grounded in inequality. What is crucial to understand is that these forms of slavery operated under moral and religious justifications tailored to each region's customs. Debt bondage was another widespread practice. If a person or family could not repay a debt, they or their children might be pledged into service until the obligation was met. This was not just economic, it was spiritual. In some ethnic groups, debt was seen as a stain, a shame that required physical restitution. The enslavement that followed was less about cruelty and more about restoring balance, at least in the eyes of the society enforcing it. But of course, for those bound in chains, those distinctions offered little comfort. Religion also played a role, and sometimes a damning one. In several regions, religious leaders wielded immense authority. Shrines, oracles, and ancestral spirits were often invoked to determine guilt or innocence. Those accused of witchcraft, sorcery, or offending the gods might be condemned to enslavement not simply as punishment, but as purification. Some oracles became feared not for their wisdom, but for their power to sentence someone to a life of bondage with a single decree. In this way, spiritual institutions sometimes became complicit in perpetuating human trafficking long before Europeans brought ships to their shores. What is unsettling is how these localized justifications would later be co-opted and expanded to serve a far more ruthless economy. When European traders arrived, they did not need to invent a system from scratch. They simply found existing frameworks and fed them. They brought goods that were exotic, powerful, and tempting: guns, alcohol, textiles, metal tools. Suddenly, a prisoner of war was not just a political token or a domestic servant. He or she became a source of profit. And with that shift, African slavery changed forever. Imagine the village chief, once content with acquiring 2 or 3 captives after a skirmish, now realizing he could trade those captives for weapons that would ensure future victories and more captives. Or the spiritual priest who saw his shrine's authority rise as more people were brought before him, accused of sins that conveniently fed the market. The old customs did not vanish. They mutated. The veneer of justice remained, but the engine was profit. Some societies resisted. They saw the danger early. Leaders like the Oba of Benin restricted slave exports when they noticed their communities unraveling. Others, like the King of Congo, wrote desperate letters to the Portuguese monarch, pleading for restraint. But many more adapted. Some built entire economies around human trade. And once the demand from the Americas surged, the logic of slavery, cultural, political, and religious, was no longer a matter of tradition. It became a business. And so we return to our earlier question. What happens when your own people profit from your downfall? In this context, the question gains new weight, because the foundation had already been laid. The belief that some lives were expendable, that guilt could be spiritually decided, that debt deserved flesh in return. These beliefs did not start with Europe. But Europe weaponized them, supercharged them, and turned them against the continent itself. As we continue this story, keep this in mind. Before the chains came from Europe, before the ships dropped anchor, before the plantations cried out for labor, there were already shackles older, quieter, wrapped in ritual and custom. The tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade is not just in the brutality that followed, but in how existing systems were exploited, amplified, and turned into something far more monstrous. This is the shadow that stretches back before the first sails appeared on the horizon, and it is one we must explore fully if we are to understand how betrayal was not a single act, but a process centuries in the making. When the Portuguese first arrived off the coast of West Africa in the mid-15th century, they came with the wind at their backs and conquest in their hearts. Driven by a thirst for wealth and the dream of empire, Their initial idea was simple: sail, seize people, and sail out again. After all, it had worked elsewhere. Why not here? But Africa was not a land waiting to be plundered. These were not isolated islands or disorganized tribes. The Portuguese quickly learned that they were dealing with established societies, fortified by centuries of internal trade, warfare, diplomacy, and deep-rooted political structures. When Portuguese ships attempted direct slave raids, like the notorious 1440 Sagres expedition into Senegambia, they were met not with submission, but with fierce resistance. Entire communities rose to repel them. Warriors armed with spears, bows, and the strategic knowledge of their terrain struck back. Some of the raiders were killed. Others fled. The message was clear: this land would not be taken easily. So the Portuguese changed their strategy. If violence failed, then perhaps commerce would succeed. And it did. What they discovered was that African leaders were not only familiar with the concept of slavery, they already practiced it, as we have seen. But they also had something the Portuguese wanted: people. What the Africans lacked, however, was technology: iron weapons, textiles, firearms, alcohol, and other manufactured goods that Europe could produce at scale. So a grim deal was struck. A new kind of relationship began to take root, not one of raiding, but of negotiation. Let us imagine this moment through the eyes of a West African chief. His kingdom, maybe a few days' march from the coast, is powerful but vulnerable. Rival clans nip at its borders. His warriors fight with wooden shields and spears. He sees the arrival of European ships not as a threat, but an opportunity. Here are foreigners bringing steel blades, muskets, and fabrics dyed in colors never seen before, items that command respect and awe among neighboring tribes. All they ask for in return are prisoners of war, or those already enslaved within the community. People who, in his worldview, are already marginal, already lost. The chief agrees. The Europeans stay offshore. The Africans control the inland supply. Caravans begin to form long lines of chained captives marching through the forest, through swamps and savannas, toward ports like Elmina, Ouida, or Luanda. These are not random kidnappings. These are organized deliveries. Over time, a market develops. Prices stabilize. A young man in good health might fetch a musket. A woman of childbearing age could be worth bolts of cloth and a barrel of rum. Children are valued less, unless they are old enough to work. The currency of humanity is being minted in real time, and everyone involved knows it. The Portuguese, and soon the Dutch, the French, and the English realize something profound. They do not need to conquer Africa. They do not need to build empires here, not yet. African systems are already doing the work for them. All they have to do is supply the right tools, the right temptations. This shift from force to trade was not a peaceful one. It was transactional, exploitative, and corrosive. Because the moment people became currency, the social contract of many African communities began to unravel. Wars were no longer just about territory or vengeance, they became about profit. Chiefs who had once raided villages for revenge now did so with shopping lists. Entire economies turned toward human export. Spiritual justifications, cultural customs, political rivalries, all were bent toward feeding this growing machine. And as this new commerce deepened, some African rulers became remarkably wealthy. Their courts dazzled with European cloth. Their warriors carried foreign guns. Their fortresses expanded. The coastal cities boomed. Some African elites even sent their sons to Europe for education. At a glance, it might be looked like progress. But beneath the surface, something darker festered. Because for every palace built with slaver's gold, a village burned in the interior. For every European ship that sailed home full of goods and captives, a family was shattered, a culture erased. And while African merchants controlled the initial terms, while they set the prices and managed the ports, they could not control the consequences. Slowly, surely, the balance of power began to shift. European traders demanded more. They pressed further inland. They offered guns to rival kingdoms, stoking conflict and dependency. What started as trade became entanglement. What started as choice became compulsion. But in these early years, it still seemed manageable. The Portuguese, humbled by their failed raids, had found a system that worked. They would not conquer Africa. They would buy it piece by piece, person by person. And so the question deepens. If a system grows not from invasion but from invitation, who bears the responsibility? If violence gives way to commerce, but the outcome remains chains and suffering, does that make the story any less tragic or more so? The truth is this: the transformation of the African slave trade from a local institution into a transatlantic industry did not begin with guns blazing. It began with trade negotiation, handshakes, and deals struck on beaches under the hot coastal sun. It began with Africans and Europeans finding a common language in profit, even if that language came at the cost of millions of lives. And as we continue our journey into the heart of this history, we must ask not only who pulled the trigger, but also who sold the powder. By the time the transatlantic slave trade reached its fever pitch in the 17th and 18th centuries, Africa was no longer simply supplying captives. It had built entire kingdoms around the trade. What began as isolated exchanges along the coast had now morphed into full-blown political economies, where rulers mobilized armies, summoned ancestral spirits, and drafted entire belief systems to justify and fuel the flow of human cargo. If the early years of the trade were marked by adaptation, these centuries were defined by acceleration. And the players in this deadly game were not just merchants, they were kings, prophets, warlords, and warriors. Each acted within a system they believed they could control. But as you will see, the machinery they helped build would ultimately consume everything in its path. Let us start with Dahomey, a kingdom that rose not in spite of the slave trade, but because of it. Situated on the slave coast, Dahomey's rulers constructed a society designed for conquest. Every year, like clockwork, they launched military campaigns against neighboring peoples, capturing thousands of men, women, and children. These were not random raids. They were state-sponsored operations, carried out by a standing army under the direct orders of the king. And at the center of that army stood one of history's most extraordinary forces, the Dahomey Amazons. These were elite female warriors, trained from childhood, fiercely loyal, and feared across the region. Imagine it: rows of disciplined women, armed with muskets and machetes, marching in silence through dense forest, returning days later with chains of captives behind them. To the Dahomey court, this was not brutality, it was economy. Captives fed the slave markets in Aouda and filled the royal coffers with guns, clothes, and wealth beyond imagining. And while some captives were absorbed into Dahomey society as servants or soldiers, many more were sold across the ocean, never to return. Travel east into the heart of Igbo land, and you encounter a very different but equally chilling engine of enslavement: the Oro Confederacy. This was not a kingdom ruled by swords, but by spirits. The Oro people controlled a vast network of trade routes and slave markets that spanned deep into the interior of southeastern Nigeria. At the core of their power was the shrine of Chukwu at Arachuku, a feared oracle believed to speak the will of the gods. People from across the region came to the oracle for justice, for answers, for divine judgment. And that judgment often came in the form of condemnation. Those accused of witchcraft, theft, or dishonoring the spirits could be handed over for enslavement. But make no mistake, this was no act of mysticism. It was an industrial pipeline cloaked in religion. The Aro priests, merchants, and warriors used spiritual legitimacy to silence resistance and funnel tens of thousands of souls toward the coast. In this world, the gods themselves became brokers. Further south, in the Kingdom of Congo, a different tragedy unfolded. Here, the story is not one of exploitation, but of warning. In the late 15th century, the Congolese king Nzinga Nku converted to Christianity and took the name Joao I. His son, Afonso I, embraced the faith even more deeply, hoping to build a modern Christian kingdom that could partner with the Portuguese on equal footing. For a time, it seemed possible, but Afonso soon realized that the Portuguese had no intention of respecting Congo's sovereignty. Portuguese merchants began buying slaves outside the king's control, arming rival factions, and undermining his authority. In 1526, King Afonso wrote a desperate letter to the King of Portugal, begging him to halt the lawlessness. "Our country," he wrote, "is being completely depopulated." He described how nobles, commoners, even members of his own court were being kidnapped and sold. It was a cry not just of outrage, but of heartbreak from a man who had tried to build a bridge and found himself drowning beneath it. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The trade continued, his reforms failed, and Congo fractured into chaos. Now shift your gaze westward, into the forests of present-day Ghana and the sweeping savannas of Nigeria, where two great empires rose, Ashanti and Oyo. These were not marginal players. These were juggernauts. Both built their strength on conquest, on gold, and on the steady stream of captives funneled toward the coast. The Ashanti Empire expanded rapidly, absorbing neighboring Akan states, consolidating power, and controlling vast trade routes that stretched from the interior to the forts at Elmina and Cape Coast. While gold remained central to Ashanti prosperity, slaves became a crucial secondary currency. The kingdom's rulers struck deals with European traders, exchanging people for weapons, alcohol, and foreign goods that cemented their dominance. Meanwhile, to the northeast, the Oyo Empire rose through cavalry power and iron discipline. Oyo's fearsome horsemen raided deep into Yoruba and Nupe lands, collecting captives who were then marched westward to coastal ports like Lagos and Badagry. The empire's economy thrived not just on external trade but on internal taxation and tribute systems built around slavery. In times of war, entire towns were depopulated. In times of peace, raids kept the supply steady. The kings of Oyo believed they had mastered the system. But as European demand grew, so too did the pressure, the infighting, and the destabilization. Eventually, the very tools of conquest turned inward. Together, these four case studies: Dahomey's militarized raids, Aro's sacred judgments, Congo's desperate warnings, and the expansionist hunger of Ashanti and Oyo form a mosaic of how deeply Africa was entangled in the trade. And yet, they also reflect different trajectories. Some rulers embraced the trade, building empires on bones. Others resisted, only to be drowned by the tide. Some hid their motives behind religion, others brandished their power openly. But all were caught in a system that offered power today and ruin tomorrow. And so the tragedy deepens. These were not passive societies overrun by foreign might. These were powerful states making choices sometimes rational, sometimes ruthless, sometimes desperate. And those choices, made centuries ago in council halls, war camps, and sacred shrines, would echo across oceans and generations. In the grand sweep of history, it is easy to speak in numbers: millions taken, thousands shipped, dozens of kingdoms rising and falling. But numbers blur the faces. They erase the names, the cries, the stolen moments of childhood, the trembling hands of fathers who never saw their sons again. And so to understand the soul of this tragedy, we must narrow our gaze not to statistics or treaties, but to individuals, to voices that survived, however rare, and to the letters that tried, however helplessly, to stop the bleeding. One such voice belonged to a boy named Oloda Equiano. He was born around 1745 in what is now southeastern Nigeria, into a respected Igbo family. His early life was filled with the familiar rhythms of a child's world, playing with siblings, learning from elders, preparing for the responsibilities of manhood. But that world shattered in an instant. One day, while his parents were away in the fields, raiders struck. He and his sister were kidnapped, bound, and dragged from their village. What followed was a journey not across the ocean, but through the maze of Africa's internal slave markets. Before Equiano ever saw a European, he had already changed hands several times, traded between African captors and masters, each one a rung lower into despair. He wrote about it years later, his words steeped in sorrow and precision. He recalled the terror of separation from his sister, the confusion of being passed from village to village, the fear that he might never see his home again. His account, the interesting narrative of the life of Oloda Equiano, published in 1789, would become one of the most powerful testimonies of the Atlantic slave trade. But even more crucially, it pulled back the curtain on what too many prefer to overlook, that the chain of bondage did not begin on the ships, it began on African soil. Equiano's story is not unique. What makes it powerful is that it survived. It shows us that even before the branding irons and ship holds, the trauma had already begun, carried out not just by foreign hands, but by African ones as well. He was sold by his own people, not once, but multiple times, and in each transaction, a piece of his childhood was carved away and replaced with silence. There were no rescue attempts, no revolts, just quiet deals in sunlit markets. Buyers, sellers, chains. And while Equiano was being shuffled through the dust of inland Africa, far to the south, a king sat in a palace and tried to stop the tide. His name was Afonso of Congo, a Christian monarch, educated and eloquent. Afonso had welcomed Portuguese influence with hope. He had envisioned a partnership of equals: trade, education, faith. He even sent his own son to study in Lisbon. But soon, he realized the price of that partnership. Portuguese merchants, eager to profit, began working around his authority. They armed rival chiefs. They corrupted his nobles. They stoked war to generate captives. His kingdom was unraveling, and he could see it. In 1526, he penned a desperate letter to King Jai of Portugal. In it, Afonso did not rage, he pleaded. He described how his people were being kidnapped, even nobles and freemen, and sold like cattle. He warned that his kingdom was being completely depopulated, and he begged for the Portuguese king to intervene, to stop the merchants, to restore order and dignity to a land on the edge of collapse. But his words vanished into the void. Whether out of indifference, greed, or political convenience, Lisbon did not answer. The trade continued. Congo fractured. And Afonso, who had once imagined himself as a bridge between two worlds, found himself standing alone as his society crumbled beneath his feet. Now pause, and consider this haunting symmetry. On one side of Africa, a king begs for the lives of his people. On the other, a child is dragged from his village and sold again and again. Both are voices trying to survive the flood. Both testify to the same reality, that the transatlantic slave trade did not simply descend like a storm. It was built, piece by piece, on choices made at every level from village raiders to royal courts. Equiano's memoir and Afonso's letter, when read together, form a kind of dialogue across time and class. One is a child, powerless, nameless, sold for goods he could not pronounce. The other, a monarch, armed with titles, seals, and Scripture yet just as helpless to stop what was coming. Their stories show us that no one was immune. Not the highborn, not the low. That is the nature of systems. Once set in motion, they consume everything. And so, as we look back across centuries of the slave trade, let us not flatten this history into a tale of outsiders and victims. Let us see the web of complicity, the moments of resistance, the cries for help that went unanswered. Equiano and Afonso stand at opposite ends of the chain, but they are bound by the same truth, that this was not just a trade, it was a betrayal, one that reached into homes, into palaces, into souls. And if we are to understand that betrayal fully, we must listen carefully to the ones who lived it. By the dawn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade had not just reshaped Africa, it had ruptured it. The soil still bore the scars of countless caravans. The forests remembered the silent marches. And the rivers had carried away the echoes of names that would never be called again. Kingdoms that once flourished with cultural brilliance and commercial strength now stood hollowed out, reeling from generations of warfare, betrayal, and an insatiable export of their own people. What began as opportunistic trading with European ships had become a self-consuming fire. And beneath the weight of that long inferno, entire communities began to unravel. In village after village, old systems of kinship, loyalty, and spiritual trust gave way to suspicion. Families no longer simply feared foreign raiders, they feared each other. A brother could be bribed. A neighbor could vanish in the night. A child could be accused of witchcraft and sold to pay a debt. The integrity of communal life, once guarded by elders and oral tradition, was now fraying, and as more guns poured in through coastal markets, the balance of power tilted further toward those most willing to spill blood. Violence, once episodic and ceremonial, became constant and industrial. The rhythms of planting and harvest were interrupted by the sudden thunder of raids. Entire regions, like the Yoruba territories in present-day Nigeria, descended into cycles of war, not for land, but for people. Kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of how many captives they could supply. Armies no longer fought solely for defense or conquest, they fought to keep the slave markets full. And in this chaos, the colonial powers circled like vultures. The British, the Portuguese, the French, they no longer needed to negotiate with powerful kings. In fact, they quietly preferred when kingdoms broke apart. Fragmented leadership meant less resistance, more pliable allies. In many places, the Europeans armed both sides of internal conflicts, selling guns to opposing rulers and watching the captives flood in. They understood a brutal truth. War kept the ships full, and the ships kept their empires running. Take the collapse of Oyo, once one of the most formidable empires in West Africa. By the early 1800s, internal strife, civil wars, and external pressures shattered its dominance. With its fall came a power vacuum, and into that vacuum flooded chaos. Smaller Yoruba polities battled each other constantly. Not for honor, not even for control, but for bodies. The ports of Lagos and Badagry thrived amid this instability, pumping out human cargo while the land behind them burned. In the Gold Coast, the Ashanti Empire, though more centralized, faced similar threats. Their wars of expansion had created enemies on all sides. And as the 19th century progressed, they too began to face growing pressure from the British, who now claimed moral superiority as abolitionists while continuing to manipulate local trade. The British outlawed the slave trade in 1807, but in practice, they tolerated and even encouraged it in territories beyond their official reach. They patrolled the Atlantic with one hand and brokered new alliances with the other. The hypocrisy was as deep as the ocean they claimed to police. Further south, in Angola, the Mbangala still roamed. These mercenary warriors, raised on the rituals of violence and the logic of survival, continued to feed the slave ports of Luanda and Benguela. But even here, the Portuguese had begun to look past their African partners. Where once they relied on African intermediaries, they now established more direct control. They garrisoned forts. They appointed governors. They taxed African chiefs not as equals, but as subjects. The trade that had once been negotiated on beaches now echoed from stone halls built to last. Colonization was no longer a shadow, it was a reality setting in brick and mortar. As community bonds disintegrated and trust dissolved, something even more tragic took root. Resignation. In some regions, the sight of chained people marching toward the coast became normal. Children grew up never knowing a time without raids. Entire generations came of age in a world where survival meant complicity. And in this moral erosion, the idea of freedom itself began to flicker. Not just the freedom to move or speak, but the freedom to imagine a future outside the trade. But here and there, resistance still flickered. There were villages like Abakuta, founded by runaway slaves and refugees from the Yoruba Wars. They built walls, they formed militias. They created a community that refused to traffic in human life. In 1851, they even defeated a Dahomey invasion, one of the few times a city of the displaced stood its ground against a kingdom built on conquest. Their survival was not just military, it was spiritual. It was a refusal to accept that the logic of the slave trade had to define the African future. Yet for every Abakuta, there were 10 more towns lost to betrayal. For every voice raised in protest, 100 were silenced in chains. Colonial manipulation deepened. Where the British could not dominate through trade, they used treaties. Where treaties failed, they used force. And by the late 19th century, as the slave trade finally waned, the groundwork for full colonial takeover had already been laid. Africa had been weakened not just physically, but spiritually. Economically, politically, its kingdoms were spent, its rulers divided, its people scattered across the seas and within their own borders. This is the legacy of the slave trade's internal dynamics. Not just the pain of the Middle Passage, but the disintegration that happened long before ships ever left the shore. It was a collapse engineered not only by Europeans, but by the participation and manipulation of Africans themselves, some willing, some coerced, all eventually caught in a system that devoured everything it touched. And so we look back not with judgment, but with understanding, with the clarity to see that the loss was not just of life, but of unity, not just of people, but of peace. The transatlantic slave trade did not simply steal Africans, it broke Africa. And that wound, centuries deep, still shapes the world we live in today. What makes a tragedy unbearable is not just the pain inflicted by a distant enemy, but the betrayal that comes from within. It is one thing to face chains placed on you by a foreign hand, it is another to know that the person who sold you was someone who spoke your language, who knew your family name, who perhaps even once shared a meal with you. That is what makes the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade so heavy, so hard to carry. It is not only a tale of European greed and conquest, it is also a story of how entire societies broke from the inside, of how fear and profit tore apart the very fabric that once held communities together. And as we trace the echoes of that history into the present, we are left not just with facts to memorize, but questions to sit with. What happens when your own people profit from your downfall? What does it mean to survive a history where the oppressor and the betrayer wore familiar faces? The slave trade was not a single, cataclysmic event, it was a slow erosion, a steady unraveling. The first links in the chain were not forged in European foundries, but in African courts and markets, where rulers weighed the cost of resistance against the glitter of foreign goods. At first, many believed they could manage the relationship, control the trade, extract its benefits without sacrificing too much. They saw themselves as partners, not pawns. Kings like those of Dahomey and Ashanti believed they were powerful enough to play the game on their own terms. They built armies, constructed economies, and negotiated prices, and for a time, they succeeded. But the trade had its own logic, and its appetite only grew. Eventually, the kings found themselves not commanding the trade, but being consumed by it. We have seen how Dahomey sent its fierce Amazons into battle, how Oyo turned war into an industry, how the Oro Confederacy cloaked slavery in the robes of religion. We have listened to the cries of a child named Aloda, dragged from village to village, sold by people who looked like him. And we have read the sorrow of a King Afonso of Congo pleading for mercy from the very allies he once welcomed. In each of these stories, there is a thread of pain that goes deeper than chains. The pain of being betrayed by one's own people. And yet, these betrayals were not born out of cruelty alone. They were often born from desperation, from survival, from the belief that selling the stranger might save your own. But in the end, no one was saved. The kingdoms that fed the trade did not endure. The leaders who believed they could profit without consequence were overthrown, colonized, or forgotten. The communities that once thrived on trust and kinship became riddled with suspicion and fear. And even those who resisted, like the villagers of Abeokuta, could not escape the shadow entirely. Because what the slave trade shattered was not just borders, it fractured memory, it turned friends into enemies, it made betrayal a currency, and trust a liability. And that is the legacy we must reckon with. Not just that millions were taken, but that they were taken with the help of millions more. That Africans were not only the victims of European empires, but at times, their collaborators, even if unknowingly, even if under pressure. It is a legacy that complicates the narrative, that refuses the comfort of clean villains and innocent bystanders. It demands honesty. It demands that we sit with the discomfort of knowing that oppression can be local, that colonization often begins before the foreign flag is planted. Yet within this complexity, there is also clarity. The slave trade was a human disaster on an unimaginable scale. It robbed generations of their roots, languages, names, and futures. It scattered families across continents, erased entire cultures, and left scars that still shape societies today, not just in Africa, but in the Americas, in Europe, across the Black diaspora. And while we cannot change what happened, we can change how we remember it. We can choose not to sanitize it, not to romanticize it, not to simplify it. We can tell the full story, with all its shame and courage, its treachery and resilience. Because there was resilience too. The people taken did not vanish. They adapted. They resisted. They formed new identities, created new cultures, passed down stories and songs that carried the memory of home. Their descendants are still here speaking the names, reclaiming the truths, refusing to let the past be buried beneath silence. And on the African continent, there is a growing movement to confront this painful history honestly. Museums, memorials, storytellers, historians, all working to stitch together what was torn apart. That, too, is part of the legacy. So as we close this chapter in our story, let us not look away. Let us not reduce the past to distant horrors committed by distant people. Let us see it for what it was: a global system built on exploitation, and also on choices made close to home. A system where the tragedy deepened not because the enemy was powerful, but because the allies were complicit. And in that truth, there is both heartbreak and responsibility. The chains may be gone, but the echoes remain. And if we are to honor the lives that were lost and the lessons they left behind, we must carry the full weight of that echo. Not to be crushed by it, but to be shaped by it, so that we do not repeat it. So that betrayal is not our inheritance but understanding, compassion, and truth. Long after the ships had sailed, long after the last chains had rusted beneath foreign suns, the children of Africa who had been scattered across oceans began to turn their eyes homeward. For centuries, they had endured the unthinkable, torn from their families, stripped of their names, beaten into silence, Yet somehow, they endured, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, something began to stir in the hearts of their descendants. A longing, a question. Could home be reclaimed? The story of return is not simple. It is not neat or triumphant. It is haunted by memory, complicated by identity, and shaped by the brutal reality that time does not rewind. But in the early 1800s, the first waves of return began not in the tens of thousands, but in small, determined groups of freed slaves, missionaries, and Afro-descendants from Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. They came to places like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Lagos, and the Gold Coast not as conquerors, but as strangers among their own blood. In Sierra, the British established Freetown in 1787 as a settlement for formerly enslaved Africans, many of whom had fought for the British during the American Revolution and were later evacuated to Nova Scotia. Cold and unwelcome there, they sought something warmer both in climate and in spirit. When they arrived in West Africa, the land was not the Eden they imagined. The local people did not see them as kin. Many of the returnees had adopted Christianity, European customs, and spoke little or no African languages. Cultural rifts ran deep. Suspicion festered. And yet, they stayed. They built homes. They married locals. They founded schools. Slowly, painfully, a new society began to form. In Liberia, the story was even more complex. Founded in the 1820s by the American Colonization Society, a controversial organization that sought to repatriate freed African Americans, the country became a haven for people escaping the racial violence and exclusion of the U.S. The capital was named Monrovia after President James Monroe, and the settlers modeled their institutions on American ideals. But this transplantation came with its own problems. Tensions quickly arose between the settler elites known as Americo-Liberians and the indigenous groups who had lived there for centuries. Once again, the ghosts of the slave trade lingered. Those who had been taken were now returning, but they returned changed. And the people they had left behind had changed too. In Nigeria, particularly in places like Abeokuta and Lagos, Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Cuban returnees, many of them freed slaves or their descendants, brought with them architecture, Catholicism, cuisine, and a fierce entrepreneurial spirit. These Aguda and Amaro communities blended Portuguese and Yoruba influences to create something entirely new. Some became merchants, others were teachers or artisans. Many helped shape the cultural and economic life of coastal cities. In doing, they created living testaments to resilience, the idea that even after everything had been taken, something could still be built. But return was not always welcomed. In some cases, returnees were seen as outsiders, their foreign dress, their religion, their ways of speaking marked them as different. In other cases, they carried painful reminders of the trade itself. Some Afro-Brazilian merchants, for example, continued participating in the slave trade for a time, even as they re-established lives on African soil. The lines between victim, survivor, and participant remained blurred, as they had been for centuries. And yet, the importance of this return cannot be overstated. In a history so often marked by rupture, these stories offered continuity. They reminded the world and Africa itself that the severed cord could be tied again. That identity, while wounded, could be remade. That home, even when lost, could be reimagined. Across the continent today, the legacy of those returnees endures. In Sierra, the Creole people maintain a unique identity, language, and cultural heritage that blends African and Western elements. In Ghana, Afro-Caribbean and African-American returnees have helped build a modern movement of diaspora reconnection from the year of return in 2019 to ongoing efforts to grant citizenship and land to those seeking ancestral roots. In Nigeria, the architectural legacy of Afro-Brazilians still graces parts of Lagos and Badagry arches and balconies whispering of Bahia and Rio, repurposed for new lives. These stories offer us something precious: the possibility of healing. The transatlantic slave trade was a wound inflicted across generations. But the act of return, whether physical or spiritual, is an act of resistance against erasure. It says, "We remember, we belong, and we are not done." For all the betrayal and complicity that fueled the trade, for all the disintegration it caused, the human spirit found a way to seek wholeness again. Sometimes in letters, sometimes in ships crossing west to east, sometimes in music, or in the quiet resolve of people who refuse to forget where they came from. That is the story that closes the circle, not with triumph, but with truth, not with revenge, but with remembrance. And perhaps that is the final legacy we must carry, that even the most painful histories can give rise to bridges, that those who were broken can still reach for one another, that across time, across trauma, the scattered pieces can speak to each other again, not as ghosts of a lost past, but as architects of a different future. And yet, even as the descendants returned, or stood before the shore with longing in their hearts, they found something more haunting than absent silence. In many African societies, the memory of the slave trade had become a wound so deep it had been buried beneath generations of forgetting. Families no longer spoke of ancestors who vanished. Villages no longer marked the paths of the chained. Shrines fell quiet. Names faded. The trauma was too immense, too tangled in shame, too painful to name. But silence, too, is part of the legacy. It speaks of how much was lost not only in bodies or in time, but in language, stories, cosmologies. The cultural memory of the trade was not just burned by the fire of history. It was buried beneath the ashes of survival. And in this forgetting, a second kind of erasure took place. Africa mourned, but in shadows. The descendants mourned, but from afar. Today, however, the silence is being broken. Across the diaspora, artists, writers, and filmmakers are reclaiming the voices of the enslaved. In African communities, elders and scholars are dusting off the old stories, revisiting oral histories, uncovering the ruins of slave forts and inland markets once hidden by forest. The earth itself remembers bones unearthed in mass graves, iron shackle rusting in dry riverbeds, forgotten graves in coastal towns. These are the voices that were silenced but never gone. They are calling out now, not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement. And it is in answering that call that healing might begin. Because the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a historical tragedy. It is a living inheritance. It lingers in the inequalities that stretch across continents, in the racial hierarchies built on centuries of stolen labor, in the mistrust that sometimes still divides Africans from African Americans, Caribbean people from West Africans, the descendants of the taken from those who remained. But it also lingers in the strength, in the music born of survival, in the spirituals sung in the fields, the drumming that crossed oceans in memory, the resilience etched into every line of poetry and every protest march demanding justice. And maybe, just maybe, that is the real message of this story. Not simply that Africans were victims and perpetrators, not only that Europe exploited and profited, but that despite it all, despite betrayal, silence, disintegration, and exile, something endured. A thread, a name, a rhythm, a will to remember. This story does not end at the coast, or in the hold of a ship. It continues in every descendant who reclaims their name, in every village that honors its past, in every child who learns not just the story of chains, but the stories that came before them of kingdoms, of poets, of healers, of empires that once sang with life before the ships arrived. It is in remembering that we resist, and in remembering together, no matter where we stand, we begin the slow, sacred work of restoration, of truth, of reunion. Because the tragedy deepens when betrayal comes from within, but the healing begins when honesty does too. History, when told truthfully, is not meant to make us comfortable. It is meant to awaken us, to challenge the stories we have inherited, to bring to light what was hidden not out of malice, but out of pain too deep to speak aloud. And this story, the story of Africa's role in the transatlantic slave trade, is perhaps one of the most difficult truths of all, because it refuses to fit neatly into the narratives we have come to rely on. It tells us that victimhood and complicity can coexist, that power and oppression are not always delivered by ships flying foreign flags. Sometimes they ride on familiar horses. Sometimes they speak in our own tongue. What we have explored together is not a simple tale of conquest. It is a layered mosaic of ambition, betrayal, survival, and silence. We began at the ports Ouida, Elmina, Lunda, places where European ships once bobbed at anchor, waiting for human cargo. But those ships did not sail inland. They waited, and Africans came to them with captives taken in war, with children kidnapped in the night, with neighbors falsely accused and condemned by oracles or courts. These Africans were not faceless. They had names, families, dreams. And those who sold them, they too were human. Some driven by greed, others by fear. Some convinced they were preserving their kingdoms, others merely trying to survive a world that was changing faster than they could understand. There were kings who profited and kings who pleaded. There were empires like Dahomey and Oyo that militarized their societies for the trade. There were networks like the Confederacy that cloaked enslavement in religion. And there were voices like King Afonso of Congo and the young Oloda Equiano who cried out in protest, who tried to stop the tide and were swept away by it. The chain of complicity stretched deep into the continent. It was a grim partnership that made the trade possible, not because Africans were uniquely cruel, but because the system itself was designed to reward betrayal and punish resistance. And the cost was staggering. Over 12 million men, women, and children were taken, torn from their homes, ripped from languages, beliefs, lineages that stretched back thousands of years. They were packed into ships where air and light were luxuries, where death was so common that the ocean itself seemed to weep with each voyage. But the horror did not begin at sea. It began long before, in the village raids, in the corrupt courts, in the caravans that marched shackled bodies hundreds of miles toward the coast. The trauma began at home, and that is what makes this legacy so complicated. Because home is meant to be safe. It is meant to be where we are protected, not preyed upon. And yet, for millions, home was the first betrayal. That is not an easy truth to carry, but it is a necessary one. Still, within this darkness, we find more than just despair. We find resistance. We find survival. We find voices that refuse to be silenced. And we find in the centuries that followed the remarkable journeys of return, of those who crossed oceans not as captives, but as seekers, who carried in their hearts a memory they had never lived, but somehow knew. In Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, we saw the fragments begin to come together again. Not perfectly, not easily, but with purpose, with hope. And now, the question falls to us. What do we do with this knowledge? Do we bury it, afraid of the discomfort it causes? Or do we confront it, not to assign blame, but to understand the full scale of what was lost, what was broken, and what might still be repaired? This is not just African history. This is global history. And it is still unfolding. in the racial injustices that echo across continents, in the generational traumas carried by the descendants of the enslaved, in the silences that persist in textbooks and family stories, and in the scars that still mark the African landscape not only in stone, but in memory. To reckon with this story is not to accuse, it is to heal. It is to say, we see you, all of you, the ones who were taken, the ones who sold, the ones who resisted, the ones who remained silent, and the ones who still carry the legacy, whether they realize it or not, because this history lives in us all, in the rhythms we dance to, in the names we bear, in the borders we live within, in the questions we ask about justice, identity, and belonging. So as we close this chapter, let us not look away. Let us honor the complexity. Let us mourn the losses and celebrate the survival. Let us hold space for the pain, but also for the possibility. Because if betrayal came from within, so too can reconciliation, so too can truth, so too can the courage to say, we know better now, and we will do better. That is how we honor the past, not by forgetting, but by remembering fully, honestly, bravely, and by building a future that no longer requires silence to survive.